Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Kenneth Rose. Ken is Senior Research Fellow at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Religion at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. He teaches and publishes in the areas of comparative religion, comparative mysticism, religious pluralism, and the philosophy of meditation. He developed and led the online course Wisdom and World Religions, which is supported by a Templeton World Charity Foundation grant. His degrees include a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and an MA and PhD in the study of religion from Harvard University. At Harvard, he was a fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. His books include Yoga, Meditation, and Mysticism, Contemplative Universals and Meditative Landmarks, which is a book we'll talk a little bit about today, and Pluralism, The Future of Religion. Influenced as much by the Bhagavad Gita as by Thomas Merton and the Buddha, Professor Rose has engaged in a lifelong quest to understand and practice spirituality in light of the sublime mystical texts and practices in the world's wisdom traditions. So with that, hi Ken, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi Jacob, thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really eager to have our conversation today. I'm looking forward to talking to you about a number of really interesting topics, including a little bit of the politics of religious studies as it's generally practiced. But we're going to explore that topic within the kind of larger conversation about a comprehensive spiritual philosophy, which I know is something that of deep interest to you, and developing that comprehensive spiritual philosophy for our contemporary context. So before we get into that, I'd love to hear just a little bit about your own personal story and kind of what led you to the study of religion, and maybe also how that, because I mentioned in the bio that you're also a practitioner, you practice this spirituality as well. So how does this the study of religion relate to your own practice?
Well, thanks for the question, Jacob. Good question. Yes. This is a discussion that I often have with with colleagues in religious studies, and it does seem to be a divide. I don't want to overstate it, but there is a kind of practitioner, non-practitioner divide in the study of religion. Mm-hmm. And some people come to the study of religion because of a curiosity or an interest that was awakened perhaps as an undergraduate in some historical matter or perhaps some cultural matter. And then there are the others, and you especially experience this in doctoral programs. There are the others who come because of a passionate involvement in an alternative religious movement. And so there are these two groups, and some of us, of course, if you spend time getting socialized in the academy, you will inevitably put on that more academic style. It will kind of overlay your practitioner base. And so that's who I am. I am a person who came to the study of religion not out of a kind of intellectual curiosity, but out of my own spiritual practice, which began in the 1960s in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
I was born in Park Slope, and I spent the first 20 years of my life there. And in the late 60s, it was a time of great cultural ferment, as you know. Mm-hmm. It was a time of consciousness expansion and exploration. And at one point, I discovered yoga. I read Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, and then I went looking for a yoga teacher. And it's hard to imagine in Brooklyn and Park Slope today not being able to find a yoga studio. There was virtually nothing. So I taught myself a sequence of asanas from a popular book of the day called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation by Jess Stern, a wonderful book, still valuable even today. And then that opened the door for me into the yoga world, those two books. And I began reading then the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita. Then the Bhagavad Gita, that led me to a deep encounter with the Krishna movement, Krishna consciousness. And that was profound influence in my life in the early 70s, deeply shaped by the bhakti traditions of Hinduism. And it was from that I began then to explore other facets of spirituality. I had a deep encounter then as I was raised in Brooklyn. I come from a Catholic family with a Jewish grandfather. I had no exposure to Protestants or evangelical Christianity, but as a Hare Krishna devotee, back in those days, we were very visible. And so I began encountering 20 times a day people telling me about Jesus. So eventually, telling me about the fact that I was on the wrong path. And this was confusing to me as a Catholic growing up in New York. And so, at any rate, it was that dilemma between these two very different and very attractive to me religious worlds that eventually led me to become a philosophy major at Ohio State, and then went off to Harvard to study religion, specifically with a focus on these deep issues of religious pluralism, religious difference, which is true. Can there be more than one true religion? Are all religions true? Questions like that. And that, of course, all along, I continued to meditate, to practice yoga, off to India, studied there in different places, and have a deep and abiding connection to Advaita Vedanta through the teaching of Ramana Maharshi.
Mm. Excellent. So the methodology of your meditation, has it sort of been consistent over those years, or have you shifted sort of modalities along the way?
Yes, well, I have shifted modalities, but as I take up in my book, the book Yoga, Meditation, and Mysticism, basically there are just a couple of meditative skills, or there are two components to meditation. You can pretty much reduce meditative styles to these two components. There's even a neurological basis for them.
Yeah.
And one of them is concentrative, you might say focused attention. And the other one is a kind of monitoring and open awareness approach, just being the witness consciousness. And what happened is early on, of course, like most meditators, I started with a concentration practice. And then I had a long time with bhakti practices, chanting, japa, and of course, all of the wonderful pujas and ritualism of devotional Hinduism. But then as I became more deeply shaped and connected to Buddhism, I began to practice more insight-based approaches, more open awareness, analytical approaches, with the result that today I would say that my practice has reduced very simply to just in a still and tranquil, concentrated state of mind, just being aware of whatever arises and not remaining attached to it. That's my basic practice today.
Beautiful. So, just to step back a little bit, you were mentioning you went into the academic study of religion from this kind of practitioner perspective. And I'm just curious, to give us a little inside view of what's happening in there. When you are taking on the kind of vocabulary and way of speaking and putting on the robe, so to speak, of kind of the academic, did you find that stifled in any way the curiosity of the practitioner, or are there, maybe another way of asking this is, are there forces within that academic environment that would sort of stifle that kind of open-hearted curiosity?
Well, the academic world has its own norms, and it's like any other high-pressured, high-status institution, like
Yeah.
a hospital or a medical center. I mean, you come as the student to medical school, you don't teach the teachers, they teach you.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing when you go into a high-powered doctoral program in the study of religion. The cultural norms, the ideological perspectives, either you adapt to them somehow, or you find yourself ejected from the system, perhaps at the master's level.
Yeah, right.
You wind up with the terminal master's degree instead of the PhD. It's a long, grueling process getting a PhD
Yeah.
in these areas. And believe me, there's a lot of opportunity for doubt and for mental distress along the way. And I would say that part of it for me was the tension between what I had to do, what I had to study, what my doctoral advisors would let me work on, and what I wanted to work on.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's happened is that since then, my own interests have reemerged. But they came back with a lot more rigor than they had before I went to grad school. And so my book on yoga, for instance, it's clearly rooted in a practitioner's perspective, which has never left me. But on the other hand, I gained many of the critical, analytical, and research tools that have enabled me to, I think, mount a fairly sophisticated argument.
Beautiful. Wow. So I guess another sort of follow-up question to that would be, have you sort of seen over the years, it seems to me from what I understand, that that perhaps there's a little bit less sneering at the practitioner within the academic environment, or there's been more of an openness to this, what we're calling, what you and I were discussing before we started recording, which is the scholar-practitioner intersection. Have you seen that to be the case? Is there sort of less sort of criticism of the practitioner within that environment?
Yes, when I first went to Harvard Divinity School to get my first master's, my Master of Divinity degree, that was 1982 or 83. And there was no public practitioner
Wow. Yeah.
there. But unless it was different. If you were training to be a minister in a religious setting, then of course you were a practitioner. But if you were a scholar of Asian religions, the practitioner perspective, it had no voice then.
Right.
And there was, and there was, but what happened is that the doctoral programs were overwhelmed in the 80s and 90s by people of my generation, the baby boomers, who were these radical experimenters in consciousness, people who went to Asia, just didn't, Alan Watts and those great figures, they did a great service by opening doors for us. But in my generation, people actually started en masse going to Asia and finding teachers. And the teachers came here as well, Buddhist and Hindu, a whole wave of them.
Yeah.
And so by the time we got to grad school in the 80s and the 90s, and now that we are the older academics, many of us, we actually were able to shift that so that the practitioner perspective has become much more acceptable. And it influences, I think, a lot of the scholarship of a lot of people that you speak to in these Chithead interviews, who are academics and practitioners.
I love the way you just very carefully pronounced the name of the podcast, Ken.
Oh yeah, well, it's that Sanskrit word chit. Yes, I like that. Yes,
I always very much over enunciate it so we don't have any confusion, although that's part of the playfulness of it, of course. So Ken, the beginning of your book, Yoga, Meditation, and Mysticism, which I very much enjoyed reading, particularly the beginning, you set the stage of sort of the academic study of religion by sort of, telling a story about this battle between two academics, one representing sort of the perennialist camp and one representing this sort of new wave of what's called constructivism in the study of religion. So I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a sort of synopsis of that sort of that opposition, and what are the stakes there in between those two positions?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I start the book with an anecdote from 1990 in New Orleans, as I recall, and it was a meeting of the American Academy of Religion, which is the main North American organization for academic religion scholars to meet, and we have a conference every year in different cities. And that year in New Orleans, it really was billed almost as if it were a prize fight, that Houston Smith, who just died after a very long and influential life last year, I believe, or the year before, who was in that period the last academic defender of the idea that there's a common core, a common mystical core or doctrinal core that the different religions express in their diverse contexts. And that's the perennialist position. And it's a venerable position, and it had a great deal of dominance in religious studies from the time of James, who was William James, but particularly through figures like W.T. Stace, a philosopher who articulated perennialism in a very cogent and influential manner. And it was so Smith was the last defender of that position. And Stephen Katz, who in 1977 published an article that has become canonical and central to religious studies, especially the study of mysticism, argued, and this argument has won the day, it's starting to weaken now, that actually there isn't a common mystical core. There isn't a kind of mysticism that Christians have and that Jewish people have, and that the Jewish and Christian elements are really secondary to the mystical experience, which States defined as a kind of unitary experience of non-duality. What Katz argued is that actually there is no such thing as a common mysticism. There's only a Christian mysticism, a Hindu mysticism, and a Buddhism. And what characterizes these mysticisms as not their commonalities, but what distinguishes them. What makes a Christian mystic Christian is that Christian mystics have experiences, say, of Jesus or the Trinity. And what makes a Buddhist mystic is that Buddhist mystics experience in the Mahayana tradition some sort of insight into the non-ultimacy of any of substances or doctrinal formulations. And so that then became it was a revolution in religious studies. And in 1990, it seemed pretty clear that perennialism had lost the day, and it had actually. And it's only just recently that I would say that attempts such as I make in my book are starting to revive not perennialism, but an essentialist approach. Perennialism has its strengths and its weaknesses. Its strength was that it stressed the essence. Its weakness was that it tended to not pay attention to the specific matter of each individual religious tradition. So a new essentialism today is sensitive to context, but it also has a great ally in neuroscience, in showing that there in fact are signatures, neuroanatomical, neurophysiological signatures of meditative states.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to get into that, and that's the direction we're moving towards, is how the way in which you're grounding this sort of new perennialism in neuroscience, which is super fascinating. But one of the things I want to just go back to this, because essentialism, as is often in many situations considered a bad word, because you think of I mean, even when I was in grad school, we were talking about the essentializing of identities and how that's an obstacle to a kind of inclusivism. For example, if I'm saying that there's an essential set of characteristics that make up that constitute women, then I am probably marginalizing various intersections, African American women, queer women, blah blah blah. And so the gesture against essentialism has been to increase the kind of inclusivity and not marginalize, at least in the context of our conversation, sort of minority religious practices that would sort of get pushed to the side in order to focus on what is said to be sort of essential. So I take your essentialism to be a little more nuanced than that, since you're taking up the banner of it again. So can you explain how we can be essentializing without being marginalizing?
Right. Well, it's a good question, and it's an important concern. And the point of constructivism, and very importantly, and not in any way to go back against it, was this stress upon the specific characteristics of individual religious traditions. And you can see the analogy very much to our cultural identities. We don't want to essentialize one type of cultural expression of being human, or a biological expression at the expense of others. So then what can we possibly say for a new kind of essentialism? Well, I would take perhaps the analogy of the hand, and how one perhaps learns the skill of doing something, driving a car perhaps, that really doesn't have much to do with our gender or our cultural identity. The physiological and the anatomical characteristics of the hand in motion seem to be universal across, but of course, that's just an example off the top of my head. I don't want, there are people who have disabilities and so on. So we can then go to the use of language. Languages are different. French is completely different from Chinese or from Hindi. Hindi is so different from Tamil. And yet, the musculature that we use in articulating sounds, even if the range of articulation points is different from English and Sanskrit, we still have the same physiology. And also the genetic capacity for language. That's universally human. That's a defining characteristic of being human, regardless of other factors. So what I guess I'm arguing, what we are trying to argue, is that there is a genetic and neurobiological signature that's associated with certain kinds of unitive non-dual mental states, and that these occur across all religious, or these can be discovered in many religious traditions, and they can be discovered outside of religious traditions. And this is what I'm interested in, is this capacity that we have for concentrative meditation and for analytical insight types of meditation. And that doesn't seem seem to be rooted fundamentally in any in biological or cultural identities, and not in any way to undercut the different religious traditions. This is not meant as a kind of move to. This was part of the problem with the old perennialism, is that often it was used to simply sidestep religious traditions, and people
Yeah.
in those traditions necessarily felt like they were being misinterpreted. So
Right.
what we want to do is shift the ground and focus upon the mystical experience, the common mystical experience, without necessarily entering into all sorts of discussions about the differences. Believe me, in religious studies, academic religious scholars will never give up the detailed, fine-grained study of particular traditions. That's like the bread and butter of our discipline.
Yeah.
What I'm just asking for is that we also return to this other bread and butter, if you will, this activity, which is to study what's common between religious traditions.
Yeah. Beautiful. So let's go then to the what you sort of who you're arguing against, and this particularly the introduction, which is, and I think also the first chapter, which is this form of constructivism. Which, why don't we just unpack that? What is constructivism? Precise. I know we're sort of talking about it, but I'd love to get sort of a definition for those that are kind of new to that academic-y word.
Right, it is a very academic-y word, and so, well, okay, so constructivism is the term that has emerged among academics, and Stephen Katz himself early on preferred a still academic-y but more intuitively clear word, contextualism,
Right.
and and the perennialism is a little bit more, people get a little bit more from that than they get from essentialism.
Yeah.
And so those are more those on the ground words. But contextualism, context matters. Basically, it's what you just said. It really does matter to how I experience being human, which cultural and biological set of characteristics are significant for me. And so context is sensitivity to that. And today, especially in the academic world, but many people, younger people in particular, very sensitive to identity and contextual issues.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sometimes older people have more essentialistic understandings, and they get threatened when they are confronted with a new generation's understanding of context. So that is what Stephen Katz did for the study of religion. He pulled us back to context. He pulled us away from abstractions and generalizations. And then perennialism. So perennialism kind of, it disappeared. Even the word sounds a little bit, like I know trolley cars and propeller planes and I don't know steamships. And so essentialism is a good philosophical word, and it essentially speaks to, for instance, if we're speaking two different languages, and you're speaking French and I'm speaking English, perhaps, we depend upon some kind of translation manual. We depend upon a
Yeah.
dictionary. And so there's a common meaning. If you say there's a red door over there in French, and I say it in English, well, it's those common meanings, whatever they are, that allow us to translate between the two languages. And essentialism is really looking more for what are the general ideas that allow us to speak from our various silos and communicate with each other. Like take an example. There was a lot of discussion about how to go home for Thanksgiving this year because of our political strife in our country and the division between so many people. How do you sit at the Thanksgiving table and speak, maybe you're coming from New York and you're going, I don't know where, and then suddenly you're speaking with people who have a completely different perspective on things. How do we speak to each other? And so contextualism can lead sometimes to such separation into different silos that we forget our common humanity. And essentialism is essentially an appeal to try to find the common meanings that can bind us back together to some degree.
I love that. I love that analogy because it really does sort of illustrate the stakes of something like essentialism in a time when, we're sort of siloing ourselves. We are, and social media and the internet encourages us into these sort of, little marketing camps, different types of people that can be marketed certain types of things because they all like the same thing. And I'm really glad you pointed that out. So I want to tease out a few features of kind of, we can see, I think it's quite clear now, we can see sort of what the what the gesture of constructivism or contextualism was and why it was justified, for good reason. But then there were some unfortunate, ramifications of that approach. One of them, you say, is how it lost sight of the mystical, and so and for me also, I find when there's sort of these cultural, contextual sort of analyses of mystical practice, it's oftentimes it seems like they explain away mystical or religious aspects by explaining them as sort of products of cultural conditions, right? So as if like mystical experience is sort of a hallucinatory byproduct of social strife, right? And so can you explain a little bit about that and how we've sort of fallen into that as a sort of as we look at religion?
Right. Well, this goes into lots of discussions that have been occurring among philosophers and theorists in so many fields connected with words like modernism, modernity, postmodernism, even post-postmodernism. So there's a lot of discourse out there. But I think a simple way of looking at this is that classically in philosophy, East and West, there's a fundamental, there are these two items that occur in a big picture theory of the universe, metaphysics, ontology. And you have a universal and you have a particular. So this pencil is a particular, and the idea of pencil is a general idea. And so I know that this is a pencil and this isn't a pencil because I'm making use of a concept that allows me to distinguish between them. The concept makes it easy because I don't have to say to myself, okay, this is not a cup, this is not a tree, this is not a clock. You get the point. It would be too, even our brain doesn't want to go through all of that. Yeah. So it uses a concept like a general notion. You can generalize to writing instrument, and that's distinguished from, a seeing instrument. So universals or general ideas are a kind of shorthand by which we're able to bring meaning very quickly to the otherwise infinite array of sensory data that's impinging upon our senses. Now, what happens with radically differentiating approaches, those that stress difference, broadly speaking, postmodern approaches, but this divide between difference and unity is as old as human thought. Those that stress difference do it always as a reaction against old universals that become oppressive, systems that are essential. Think of Kierkegaard over against Hegel. And so there's a revolutionary call back to the particulars, back to context, and that is necessary. And it may work for a generation or so, but then you get to the point, you said it so nicely there, that it starts out as a powerful call to affirm our identity over against oppressive, generalizing, essentializing structures. But in our hyper-capitalist society, very quickly they become marketing niches as well.
Yeah.
And then people become a little bit, I'm just like marketing myself here. And then we get a little bit tired of that. But not only that, we start to lose our ability to communicate with others. And so that's why, if you present me with that, and then that, and then that, at some point I can say, writing utensils, instead of, in a fetish-like manner, only interested in this. So you can take religious studies when it gets to the point of stressing difference too much. I give this illustration in my book. A religious studies scholar can be not interested in the general notion of writing instruments like I am, but interested only in this particular object. It has a point, it's red, it's spherical.
He's lifting up a red pen for those that can't see him.
Right. I'm holding a red pen. And then I want to know about the social history of this object and who used it and where it was bought, to the point where I know everything about this except that it's a writing instrument. That I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know that its function is basically to write. Or if I do know that, it's not interesting to me.
Yeah.
So that's the fundamental issue with overstressing difference, when it becomes a kind of a cliched gesture, is that then we become isolated in our own islands of significance, to the point where ultimately we even lose our ability to communicate with anybody except ourselves. And that's what leads to a painful narcissism. Too much stress on difference can lead to one of the great social crises of our time in the United States today is our social isolation, our sad to say, our narcissism, and our increasing incapacity to make these deep connections that older generations had. So I think that a return to common meaning, dangerous as it might be, fraught as that can be, might a little bit of a nudge in that direction could help us perhaps to start creating some common structures of association, affiliation, of meaning with each other again across all of the various divides that separate us right now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And another kind of feature of this that I think we're speaking about is what you point out as being this constructivist approach often negates the emic or the insider perspective of
Yes.
the
Right.
for the so-called objectivist position, which oftentimes and we've also had all these critiques of the objective position because it actually turns out to be a very particular position, one that has scientific ideology, reductionist kind of materialist approach. So
Yeah.
really what turns out to be, the true objectivity, if we can even use that word in this instance, seems to be something like the insider, or at least understanding the kind of inner landscape rather than assuming that you get something objective out of this, this sort
Right.
of this other standpoint.
Yes, I mean that's extremely well stated, and what that prompts me to respond by saying that, as you know, and already 30 years ago, the whole notion of objectivity, which was completely discounted among academics. We haven't, this has been something that's been theorized and has been criticized away for generations now. And it has slowly come into the mainstream discourse. You don't really hear much about the objective journalist any longer, whereas that used to be a stock in trade idea, even until recently. No, what postmodernist studies and critical theory has shown is that every position has an implicit ideology. Every perspective is over determined with values and biases. From that perspective, there can be no objectivity, which of course then becomes an argument against essentialism. So the question is, can we go too far with that sort of argument? And what you see is very, very odd. And you mentioned this. It's that you sometimes find that academics in their who study religion will, in their historical critical approach to a religious tradition, will produce an account of that tradition that is completely alien to the emic perspective.
Yeah.
The etic perspective is completely contrary to it. And the people inside the tradition just wholesale, they reject it.
Yeah.
And the academic then becomes a person who sometimes uses that authority, that perch, to insist that they don't understand. We understand better. And so ultimately, the person who started out to understand the insider becomes the ultimate outsider, denouncing or misunderstanding the insider perspective from the standpoint of what the insider sees as the alien theoretical perspectives of the Western, North American, or Eurocentric academy.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And, that sort of made me think, while you were talking, it sort of made me think about how even there's this, obviously there's the emek, I guess that's how you pronounce it, insider view of particular religions. And then there's the insider view even of, we're talking about how in religious studies it's this constructivist, anti-perennialist approach. And yet most spiritual people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, this whole movement, that's the fundamental, perennialism is the fundamental view. I mean, and so there's, even in religious studies, it's like a denouncing of what people in just the general population take to be the case.
Right. That's clearly the case. I noticed that very early on that regardless of what academics would say, the perennialist approach, by whatever name you like, that's the approach that appeals to people. Because let's face it, the academic approach is interesting.
Hmm.
It's interesting to know about well, it can be revolutionary too, but it's interesting at the very least to know about the social history of a particular practice.
Certainly.
But it doesn't, and it can be very liberative for people in context who may be oppressed in that context. So it has its revolutionary characteristic, but it can also seem rather flat to people who approach, let's say you approach the Yoga Sutra because you're a yogi and a meditator and you want guidance. So that's a completely different perspective from someone who approaches it because you're interested. You want to understand how that text reflects a kind of Brahminical appropriation of shamanic traditions to serve ultimately to serve in the social context of India, the interests of that group.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and then
Yeah.
also sort of on that note, I feel like there's when one, and this is happening a lot, I feel like, because more and more people are interested, for example, within the yoga community, of reading the work of academics on kind of the history of hatha yoga, and it is fascinating work, but there's a kind of danger, I think, and maybe danger is wrong, too inflammatory a word, but there's this kind of risk of, by overemphasizing the kind of specificity of a particular historical juncture and a particular context approach to the practice, it alienates the kind of livingness, aliveness of the practice for the practitioner by it,
Yes.
because then they sort of, there's also this implicit argument, I feel like, that in the study of hatha yoga, that these are the authentic practices. And if you're not practicing these authentic practices, which are often it's very other, it's like, we're not necessarily going to suck, juice up our, anal passage, or, whatever obscene things are happening, and so it's sort of like, well, if I'm not practicing that authentic practice, then I'm not really practicing yoga. And so I guess I might as just throw everything out. They
Right.
don't, as what you're saying, it's like, what is lost again is what is the common thread that even in this very, like, seemingly radically different contextual moment, there is still something of yoga there that resonates with my own experience.
Yes, yes. I mean, as you said, what's the common thread? And I think that so I'm a philosopher. That was my major as an undergraduate, and I studied with philosophers at Harvard. Hilary Putnam was one of my doctoral
Oh,
advisors.
wow,
So
amazing.
my Yeah, he was a great human being. One time when I was ill and he was reading one of the chapters in my dissertation, up at the Center for the Study of World Religions, Hilary Putnam came to my home to read the chapter with me, and
Amazing.
he was a really great human being, a great successor to William James, whom he deeply admired. And so I have always been shaped and fundamentally concerned by philosophical issues. And, from a philosophical standpoint, philosophers bring certain skill set to these questions that maybe a tech scholar doesn't. And usually in the academy, we're aware of that. But philosophers have a harder time getting their perspective across, probably because we don't have like a broad-based material, register of activities and events. We're doing it up here.
Yeah.
And the reason why we're doing it up here is because, well, fundamentally, conceptually, you cannot have difference without sameness. You don't have them in isolation from each other. So at any time, you need to find a balance between stressing the common thread and stressing the unique contexts. And sometimes you have to kind of bend to one side and sometimes to the other, but you can never eliminate one or the other. You can never eliminate difference. You can never eliminate identity or sameness. And I think that if we were to take that basic bit of philosophical that conceptuality on board, we could avoid a lot of these issues. And I think with yoga, but I don't want to go on so long with the answer. But I think that you're raising the question of what counts as real yoga. Of course, that's probably one of the discussions we're going to get into.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't even, I sort of hesitate to even ask that question because,
Ah, yes,
but I think that, your way of answer, because oftentimes, again, it's sort of like universalizing a particular, which is
yes,
a different approach than what you're taking as far as, the yogic mystic itinerary, which we're going to talk about. But
ah,
I
yes,
guess my last sort of comment on, who were critiquing, which is, I love this term, the fetishization of the particular, and it sort of reminds me of, again, I'm going back to the hatha yoga work, which again, I don't want to, I don't want to like criticize it because I think it's fascinating. It's so important for us to understand the history, but it's sort of, I think it's also interesting. It's an important question to ask. So what? You know what I mean? In terms of the practitioner, how does the kind of hyper particularization of this knowledge necessarily relate to my own, again, yogic mystic itinerary? And so when I asked this question actually of James Mallinson when I was interviewing him, and I appreciated his answer because it was very honest. He said he wasn't very. I asked him, how does this research relate to the practitioner? And he was like, well, I'm not actually positive or that it does. And that sort of, says that the kind of trajectory of historical research might be something different than the kind of trajectory of the practitioner. And so I think it's just some one of those things that's important to keep in mind, because oftentimes it's becoming, as we get really fascinated by all the historical research, and I can speak mostly from yoga because that's my kind of world, but as we get fascinated by this research, it is important to remember that it is sort of like, it's a parallel, and it's interesting as sort of as a historical curiosity, but when we try to translate it to our own kind of, mystical practice, it might be maybe not so important.
Yes.
So,
yes.
The fetishization
I don't know
of
if
the
that's
particular.
a question or a transition point, but I do agree with you on that. Yes.
Well, I guess my question out of that, sorry, I sort of went on. I'm enjoying. I love this conversation. It's
I
very
could answer it. I could respond better. Yes.
Well, my question is more, what is the fetishization of the particular, and how is that sort of maybe becoming an issue?
Right, and so I guess what I meant was, should I respond to that? We're transitioning on, because I think that I think it's clear this idea of the fetishization of the particular is one of the kind of weaknesses or professional biases of academic religious studies. And in my book, I give this example, and I give this thought experiment of an auto engineer who knows everything about, who is a theorist, a wonderful theorist, and is there because of her capacity to solve fundamental conceptual mathematical issues, but doesn't care about cars, and doesn't even own a car, lives in a big city, maybe New York, and is on the subway and gets an Uber once in a while, right? And then you have another person, and that person would be the essentialist, perennialist philosopher. Doesn't care in the slightest about the particulars. All I want to know is, I want to stay here with this theorizing. And then you have another person, a kind of social historian, has a 1957 Bel Air Chevy or something like that. Pick a different car, and knows everything. Can document down to each piece where it was produced, its part number, and then the social history of that car, who drove it, has record of every owner, has gone and interviewed those people. But again, this person maybe lives in San Francisco and takes Uber all over the place, has no interest in cars. I don't know where they would keep the car. He actually has restored the car too. And that's a bit of a way and a thought of experiment of trying to get at what happens with the fetishization of the particular. We lose sight of what the car is for. We're so caught up in detailing the part numbers and telling you the social history of the production facility that produced that part. I can write a dissertation on that. But hold on a second. What about driving? Oh, I don't even have a driver's license. Sorry, I have no interest in it. There's Uber. I can take Uber. Uber's there. Yeah, I can rent. I can get a zip car when I need one. All right. So that is the danger of that approach, and I think it does go to. So I want to be careful when talking about these matters. It's easy again to generalize.
Yeah.
To overgeneralize, and then talk about a kind of practitioner. Scholar divide. I think that it's subtler than that. And a lot of really great practitioners, scholars, they may not talk about their practice. And some of them may not practice, and others may practice, but they feel that it's inappropriate to talk about it. Yeah. And they have two hats if you will. The practitioner had, and then the scholar had. And by the way, James Mallinson's book, The Roots of Yoga, I was just reading it again last night as I prepared for this. This is an excellent, excellent book because it helps to answer, I think, a lot of questions that have been raised in recent academic yoga scholarship. And I generally tend to take the Mallinson approach on these questions. And the scholarship there is immense, and the recovery of text is extraordinary. Well, I guess what I would like to say, fundamentally, what I see yoga as, if you want to find the kind of essential kernel of this, if we can even do that, and not even of yoga as a word, because that word wasn't applied early on to what we today call yoga. Yoga fundamentally is this concentration of the mind, or concentration in order to awaken to the spiritual ground of life. Yeah. And where that is present, I think we can safely say we have something like yoga, or dhyana, perhaps to use an earlier word that's part of the Yoga Sutra. And if we have that, then everything else can be seen as different ways of trying to evoke that mystical state.
Yeah. And, and I just want to even go back for a second and say that, after in the spirit of nuance, after I sort of said that about the fetishization of the particular in the context of yoga studies, which, again, I've also read that book. I think it's an amazing book. But just to kind of go back on what I said a little bit, I think it also is it's inspiring people to remember because in these texts it's very obvious what yoga is. It's a practice that is other than, or at least, more than the asana practice. And I think that itself, for the practitioner, to inspire one to really engage in the more subtle practices, that's really, at least if I'm asking why it's important to practitioner, that certainly is one of the reasons. So now, okay, so in you mentioned in your book, the question put by the constructivists is, or the kind of argument of the constructivists is, well, there is no one religion, or there is no perennial religion. There are just many religions with an S. And your sort of simple response to that is, well, why do we call them religions in the first place? And exactly. So then, as we move into this, your way of handling the kind of new perennialism, if I can just sort of share what you say, you want to rehabilitate essentialism, or this perennialism, on contemplative universals rather than symbolic universals. So do you want to kind of help us, transition into this exploration of contemplative universal? I guess first we have to go through the brain to get to the contemplative universals. So maybe we'll start with that.
All right. So in the book, I give an itinerary where I speak about 5 contemplative universals, and this is clearly essentializing talk. And that's a long. There are 5 stages to it. Probably don't have time to go through all that right now. But let me try to get to the very kernel, the essence of this, and say that there are 2 basic kinds of mysticism that have been studied in the study of the philosophical study of mysticism. And what we have, and this goes back to in Hinduism, it's there in Buddhism, and so on. It's the difference between a content-rich, sensually and emotionally rich sense of interaction, experiential encounters with sublime realms. And that's often known as cataphatic spirituality or extrovertive mysticism. In Sanskrit, these are saguna, with form approaches. That's samprajñata samadhi in the Yoga Sutra. Apophatic mysticism in the Western tradition, cataphatic. Now, on the other hand, what we have is this experience, that's even beyond experience, a sense of non-dual unity that is ineffable because words simply fail. Yeah. At a certain point, words and images drop away. The gods, the deities, all of the subtle realms, they simply fade away. And what's left is this extraordinarily blissful sense of non-dual, infinite consciousness, which if one backs away from it a little bit, one starts to sense that these are the vistas that the Buddha and the great siddhas they speak about, the all of these subtle realms. And so you have this divide between the two, and they correspond today to, if you will, open awareness, just sitting and being the witnessing self, and then focused attention, which when we become focused, what we start to notice is that our sense-based perceptions are slowly replaced by what seem to be subtler perceptions, altered states, to use a very materialistic concept, which are actually concentration is a doorway into the subtle realms. Now, in virtually every civilization except modern Western scientific civilization, which I see as very reductionistic and monodimensional, this was understood as an opening into the spiritual realms, the subtle realms. And so there are two mysticisms. One explores the subtle realms. It can lead to siddhis. It can lead to great powers, to omniscience. One can get caught up in that and become, and then there's the other mysticism that leads to this extraordinary state that's prior to all division. Now, it turns out that there seems to be a neurological, a neurophysiological correlate to that increasingly has been replicated in other studies, and it goes back to Andrew Newberg and Eugene Diacolis' discovery. They're neuroscientists. The discovery of that when through meditation of the second type, and they've diversified this other forms of meditation. This is about, I guess, 20 years ago now, that there is a reduction of blood flow in the posterior superior parietal lobe, this side of the head, basically, the right parietal lobe. What has been noticed in recent studies is that as the blood flow in that area decreases, and why does it decrease? Why is there a reduction in metabolism in this side of the brain? Because the signals coming from the senses and from and other parts of the brain. I'm not a brain scientist. I'm a philosopher, but it's extremely helpful to look to these studies as the blood flow and reduces. What's actually happening is there's a reduced amount of transmission, electrical transmission to that part of the brain. It's called deafferentation. And as that deafferentation occurs, the sense of being a separate body in space disappears. And this is what some have said is a kind of neurological, neurophysiological, even neuroanatomical signature of non-dual unitive mystical states. And that's why someone like I today find more allies in contemplative neuroscience or effective neuroscience or neurotheology than I would find among many of my colleagues in religious studies departments.
Yeah, it's such exciting research, and obviously we'll be exploring that, and you'll be a part of this conference coming up where we're going to be looking at some of that research. So I guess the immediate question, obviously, is that the skeptic is gonna hear that and say, well, that just means that the brain is hallucinating, mystical experiences, and we're just built for these kinds of hallucinations, and it doesn't really, say that something actually mystical is happening. It just says that something wildly imaginative is happening. How do we get around that?
Well, of course, that's the first response that always comes, and it's an important response. I've heard it many times, and I have many ways of dealing with the first one. The most important one, not the most important, but the first one is that, so what? It's a great experience, all right? And how would we know the difference? How would we know? I mean, we experience it as a mystical state. We can't get outside of ourselves, if you will, and nobody else can either. The materialist has no more access to that view from nowhere that would say conclusively, this is just brain generated. And than I have. Now, of course, you can do things to the brain, like with the God helmet, Persinger's God helmet. You can stimulate with electrical stimulation of the temporal lobe, and in his non-replicated, in his experiments with people put on these electrodes, the EEGs, the God helmet, 80% of people had experiences of divinities and angelic entities. And famously, even Richard Dawkins put it on one time.
Wow.
And and but I guess the question is the example I like to use. So that's one. What difference does it make if you have that experience? It's like, for instance, none of us will ever really experience death,
Yeah.
because either when we die and death, there is another life and we directly transition into that, or if the materialists are right and when we die we're dead, when the brain activity stops and the cells disintegrate, then you're really dead. It's not like near death experiences. I mean, because those people's brains are still functional, they can still be resuscitated, but those cells are dead. The brain is gone, it cannot come back. You're dead at that point, but you will never experience it, because to experience is, you can't experience death because you have to experience it. And the last thing you can experience is the moment of death. You cannot experience death itself. Mm-hmm. And so if a near-death experience makes that extraordinarily blissful, then your last brain event is that of extraordinary bliss. And that's all you'll know. You won't know death because you'd have to be alive to experience death. So that's a little bit of a kind of, for undergraduates, it's always fun to work with that one.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, that one is sort of like, because when you say that because there are some people who remember death, but of course those people who remember death aren't going to be denying the fact that something continues after death. Yeah.
Right. So then the second approach I would take to that is that from a metaphysical standpoint, we have no way of saying that the materialist perspective or the idealist perspective is the case. The data doesn't, you can't, that's why philosophy is different from data-based sciences. These are just two global ways of perceiving the same data. And maybe it's temperamental that you choose one or the other. Now, I would say it's not merely temperamental, but the whole history of human spirituality and religion up until the current materialism of the modern West, with a few materialist movements here and there, has essentially agreed that religious experience is an experience of something that's real and that's external to our physical forms. So take another example. So you take your smartphone, and the smartphone, let's say you don't have any network connection, no Wi-Fi, you're in airplane mode. Well, you can look at your pictures and you can maybe read some old things on your Kindle or look through some stored emails or whatever, but you can't really connect with anything. You're basically stuck. That's the materialist model, if you will, of the brain and its experiences. But actually, as soon as you touch the ground, we're out of airplane mode. And immediately we're getting our text messages, our WhatsApp messages, our emails are coming down. We got the New York Times again. Boom, we're connected. And from the non-materialist, idealist perspective, that's what the brain and the body is really like. Now, so basically it's more the transmission model, the filter model, rather than the kind of closed box model. Yeah. I mean, you remember back, I don't know, but when I got my first computer in 1983, I mean, it was rare to have a personal computer in those days. It had no internet connectivity. Apparently, early on, even Steve Jobs didn't want his little machines to have internet connectivity. So you had a word processing device. You had a spreadsheet processing device. Yeah. And that's essentially the materialist approach. But today, our devices are connected to the cloud. We couldn't bear to not be connected to all of these sources. So what's the difference? Some would say, well, it's still brain generated, because after all, if you have a neurological illness, it can change how you perceive things. Yes, if you have an old flip phone, right, and the plane lands, you can of course flip it back on and get your text messages and your emails, but you're not going to be able to get your Kindle, your photographs probably. You're not going to be able to get a lot of other stuff. And if you've got a top of the line smartphone, you're suddenly plugged into all sorts of stuff. Or suppose you drop your phone, or suppose there's an app that you want to use that's available at the App Store, but it's not an Android app. Well, the app's still out there.
Yeah.
And you just can't use it because you don't have a phone that can access it. So those are different approaches. Another example would be an older example, but pretty clear. It's like, for that second issue, back in the day when not everybody had a color television. It's hard to imagine, but there was a time. I grew up in a home, we had a black and white television. And when we got the color television, was a big deal. That's a long time ago. But even today, if you turn on an old black and white television, you're not going to get the color imagery. And in a way, that's a little bit like, differences between different brains with their different, pathologies and capacities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone use the technological device as an analogy for what the brain the function of the brain.
Yeah,
Because you would never think, obviously, as you're saying, that, my the emails I receive originate in the computer in the same way that, the mystical
right.
experience originates
Exactly.
in the brain in some way. It's that I have a device that may or may not be used to facilitate certain tasks or to facilitate
Right.
certain inherent, abilities. So that's such a good analogy. So okay, so we're sort of nearing the end of our conversation, which has
Yes.
been
Ah, yes.
inspired and totally fascinating. It's been I've done 3 this week, and this has been
Oh,
one of my favorites for sure. Um, so the spiritual philosophy, the comprehensive spiritual philosophy that is sort of what you super interested in your own work. How does that is contemplative universals, the work on contemplative universals, a part of that, or is there more to kind of this overall project that you foresee happening in your work in the future?
yes. Well, at the end of the day, as an academic, I am a philosopher, and my fundamental concern is to articulate a metaphysical standpoint that is idealist, uh, or that is immaterialist. And that is, I see that fundamentally reality is consciousness. That's the word idealism is a Western term, but it's a little bit weak to express that. And fundamentally you can find analogies in Yogacara, in Buddhism, and certainly in Vedanta.
Hmm.
Um, but uh, but fundamentally, reality is consciousness, and in its own self, in its uh, own most form, it is beyond any even the word consciousness. But it's non-dual, and out of this consciousness, there arises as a self-expression of the divine, of non-duality, of Brahman, however you like to describe it, or even the emptiness, the shunyata, that dazzling ground of non-ultimate realities. What emerges from that is a completely integrated universe, which is both physical and material at the same time. And because it emerges from this source, they are coded. They have an underlying code, a dharma, if you will, that expresses in different registers. And one register is the physical, another register is the psychological or the mental, and another is the spiritual. And in each case, what we discover is the dharma of moving away from dispersion in particulars and a movement back towards union with the source.
Hmm.
And so and so and so in our ethical life, we find that if we stress community and selflessness to some degree, our lives and our communal lives will go better than if we are always about ourselves. And similarly, in spiritual matters, we discover that if we turn within and focus our attention upon an inner point, we begin to experience a kind of unparalleled happiness, and then eventually we come to the place where we experience a kind of self-transcending oneness with what's ultimate. And so, I guess the point I'm making is that the spiritual basis of life expresses itself in multiple registers, and at the physical level, at the psychological level, at the metaphysical level, and that a non-materialist metaphysic, which was very dominant in Western thought until about 120 years ago. Think of people like Bradley, think of Hegel before him. Um, it sees that the unity of life is in consciousness, and that its basic pattern expresses itself in all of these different levels or layers of being. And to recognize that underlying pattern, the dharmas, is what the essentialist does. And that's essentially what my philosophical project is about. And central to that is meditation, because
Yes.
meditation is the fundamental probe
Yeah.
And meditation is yoga in the broadest sense of the term. It's the fundamental tool that we have to discover these realms of insight and experience.
Yeah, so my question that came up while you were describing that, which is fascinating and so inspiring to hear, is you mentioned in the book a meditation based metaphysics. So I'm just curious, can we just a quick kind of what is the difference between metaphysics traditionally conceived and a meditation based metaphysics?
Well, so there isn't there. So basically, that's a praxis. That's a metaphysics with a praxis, with a practice.
Yeah.
So now, when you look at the great metaphysicians of Indian and Buddhist thought, they were all great contemplatives.
Yes.
Shankara,
Yeah.
Nagarjuna. These were people who weren't just, but they also were great philosophers. They could work with the conceptualization. Now, when you look, someone very wittily said, a critic of German philosophy, looking back at Hegel and at Fichte and others from that German idealist period, and even up to Bradley in the English period, is that this was a profound insight into the nature of the universe from an idealist perspective, but it wasn't associated with a yogic practice. They didn't have a consistent contemplative practice that they could communicate to others. So because when you are in a deep state of non-dual insight, there's no conceptualization there. But the moment you return from that, the very moment the buddhi is the first of the tattvas or principles that begins to operate, and the buddhi distinguishes between non-duality and the rest of experience, and then you can use that capacity to begin articulating what the different structures are that arise naturally from the divine source, and so you may forget. I think even the great philosophers, they didn't realize it. A Hegel and a Bradley, they were actually utilizing that same skill that the contemplative philosophers of Asia did, but they just didn't recognize it. They didn't really realize or articulate that they were using yogic intuition, analytical cutting through of phenomena to discover the non-dual empty in the Buddha sense of the term, interrelational ground, the dazzling radiance that's at the very base. The dazzling radiance isn't ultimate. The dazzling radiance is what the buddhi distinguishes in that last moment before there's a dropping off into complete non-dual awareness, in which there is no longer any conceptualization. But as soon as the contact is made again with biophysical existence, then the buddhi and all of the other tattvas immediately spring into play.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that about Hegel, because I think it's when we look at the Western canon, what's always interesting to me is the way in which it sort of I mean, it's the way it reads its own history is kind of in this sort of materialist way. But of course, we could go back to the Greeks and we could see so much of what they do from a spiritual perspective. I mean, they were definitely contemplatives, and then that aspect of the ancient Greek tradition just was not carried forward in the kind of canonical unfolding of the Western tradition.
Yes.
So, okay, so the other thing that, well, I wanted to just mention also that when you were talking about, or this meditation-based metaphysics, I really liked this term that Jeffrey Lidke, I think, used in his book on the Shakta tradition of Nepal, was to use this term performative metaphysics, which I really like, because it's the idea being performative I take to mean in that context, or that term to mean sort of that it's not the real as just like a term. Reality isn't just a term that is used to intellectually refer to something. It's actually something that you perform in states of meditation.
Yes.
You experience that
Yes.
that state of reality. So that seems to be like one of the defining features. So do you have anything else? This has been awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation, Ken. Do you have any other things you want to mention that would wrap up kind of what we've been speaking about? Any sort of untied threads that you'd like to mention or explore?
Well, this has been a great conversation, Jacob, and you're really very stimulating, and I've enjoyed it. And I guess my final comment would be is that in the spirit not of is that this is one historically grounded persons and yours as well understanding in this specific moment with a good-willed attempt to try to make sense of all of this.
Yeah.
Will people in 5 or 10 years, or even right now, look at what's been said and see that it essentializes in the wrong way? No doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can say to that is I look forward to being more deeply enlightened, and what we should have charity in the moment for people's attempts with goodwill to make sense of very complex phenomena. And that has always guided me. I think that's one of the virtues of the academic life as far as I've experienced it. It was a place where I was allowed to question using rigorous methods without worrying that I would, alienate somebody. Of course, that's not completely true because we had our doctoral advisors. Oh, well. So you see, every time we make a statement like that, we can always think of a counter argument. As a professor for many, many decades, I can say that no matter what position you argue, there's always a counter argument. And the more brilliant the person, the more counter arguments they can come up with. Or I might say the most brilliant person is the person in the room who can counter argue even the ultimate expression of truth that everybody else agrees upon. So at any rate, I could go on for many more hours, but it's been great talking with you.
Well, you will go on for many more hours in the course you're teaching with us. So I want to mention that because as everybody who's listening is probably going to be very inspired by you and your work. So if you want to learn more from Ken, he will be teaching a course with us in February called The Global Mystic, and he'll go much deeper into some of the areas and material that we've explored today. I guess this is my own curious question as well, but maybe it'll be helpful for some people who are interested in the academic study. But from a practitioner standpoint, it seems to me that what stands out about the Graduate Theological Union is that they're doing this kind of it's a place that's receptive to this kind of work. Are there other programs that are also open in this kind of way?
Well, that's one of the. Yes, I would suggest. So the GTU has perhaps the largest doctoral faculty, but there's also my alma mater, Harvard. Harvard's the study of religion at Harvard, as well as the Harvard Divinity School. They're different entities within the same university. For me, Harvard Divinity School and study of religion was an extraordinary place where I was able to explore and to critically engage, both as a practitioner, more under the table in those days, and also all of the intellectual riches of really the whole world's spirituality. Other programs, of course, at the University of Virginia. I live in Charlottesville. They have also a large, if not the largest, religious studies department. Graduate Theological Union is a freestanding theological school. University of Virginia has a large and very influential religious studies department. Also, the University of Chicago has one of the great religious studies departments as well. So if you're interested in studying religion at the level at which I have been able to study it, and many of the people that you're interviewing, then these are the places that you would be first on your list. And I'm sorry if I'm forgetting any others.
No, that's okay. But you think, because that's interesting, because you do think that, I just wouldn't know, obviously, but I would have assumed that a place like Harvard or Chicago would be sort of kind of this sort of maybe places of the constructivist camp, just because they're so sort of such traditional institutions. But you're saying that it is a very receptive and open minded kind of place to study in this way.
Yes. I can speak for Harvard. I can speak for GTU. But what I would say is that, so what happens in these places, what we were talking about at Harvard when I was there in the early 80s and 90s, many of those topics, they didn't become mainstream until recently. Mm-hmm. We really were standing, because academics at this level, we really do study all of these phenomena. And we have the grants. If we're professors, we get the grants as graduate students that allow us to go and live on site with so many people. And so it can harden into, and it often does harden into, institutional biases like constructivism only. But now today, there are younger scholars who are exploding that paradigm in these places, or they're raising other questions. And the faculty in these places are often they're they're people who are products of this extremely liberal, progressive environment, and they
Yeah.
often hear what their young graduate students are saying to them.
Yes.
And so again, everything is in context.
Yeah.
But for me, the greatest experience in my academic life, aside from was of course being a grad student at Harvard.
Beautiful.
That for me, there was nothing that parallels that in my life at the Harvard Divinity School and being a grad student at Harvard. I wouldn't trade that for me. Today in the United States, I think universities are our greatest cultural asset and institution. And I love universities. And I think that a place like Harvard, a place like the University of California, University of Virginia, name any public or private university, that accredited university, they are the elevator for so many people for social mobility. Bringing a place like Harvard, for instance, can also bring people. A place like the University of Virginia brings people from disadvantaged backgrounds and gives them the ability, the skills, and the credentials that can help them live much richer lives. And I know because I grew up in a working class background in Brooklyn back in the day. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I went to Ohio State, and I went to Harvard. And so I would say that our universities, for me, are our greatest treasure.
That's beautiful.
And I have only reverence and respect for them, and they can take whatever criticism we bring to them.
Yeah, they certainly can. Yeah. So this has been wonderful, as I've mentioned. Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate it. And for anybody that wants to get in touch with you, is there a website that they can turn to?
Well, they can, let's see. Yes, there is my Facebook page at Ken Rose. Just put in Ken Rose and yoga. That'll bring it up probably. I also have a website. It's called the Radiance of Awareness.com. And I have stored there, archived there, my current course, which we're looking for funding to mount it again. It's called Wisdom from World Religions. It's a course that we just had the Templeton Foundation funded that. We ran it twice. We're looking for funding to run it again. So that is also wisdom. Excuse me. What did I say? The radiance. I always often say it wrong. I better look it up.
That's
because
okay.
If I give you the wrong one, then I'll get emails from everyone saying we can't find that. Let me just click here. It's the radiance of awareness.com.
Okay. Radiance of awareness.com.
And you probably will pull it right up there. The radiance of awareness.com.
All right. And then again, if anyone wants to learn from a little bit more from Ken, he is both participating in our forthcoming conference, which is happening February 2019, which is called the Embodied Brain, Neuroplasticity, forgetting the full name, Neuroplasticity and Contemplative Science, basically, and contemplative practice. So we're looking at, some of the stuff we've talked about, the intersection of neuroscience, the discovery of neuroplasticity and how it relates to contemplative practice. And then Ken will also be giving a course, as I mentioned, starting in February, mid-February. It will be our second course of that quarter. So keep your eyes peeled for more information on that, everyone who's listening and interested. And Ken, I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.